The morning sun cast long shadows through the crystal windows of the Galactic Academy's most famous lecture hall. Students from dozens of worlds filled the tiered seats, their various forms creating a colorful tapestry of alien life. Blue-skinned, Altarians sat next to towering plant-like verdans, while small insectoid hivelings clustered together in the middle rows. Energy beings called luminals floated near the ceiling, their soft glow adding warmth to the room. Professor Thane adjusted, his notes at the podium, his crystalline features catching the light. As one of the galaxy's leading experts on xenopsychology, he had spent decades studying how different species thought and felt. Today's lecture would be his most popular one of the semester. Fear response mechanisms. Across sentient species, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic systems. The chatter died down as students prepared their recording devices and data tablets. In the back row, almost forgotten among the sea of alien faces, sat David. The human looked unremarkable compared to his classmates. No shimmering scales, no multiple arms, no natural bioluminescence. Just brown hair, average height, and clothes that seemed plain next to the elaborate garments worn by beings from more advanced civilizations. Most students barely noticed him, which was exactly how David preferred it. Fear, Professor Thane began, is perhaps the most universal emotion in the galaxy. Every thinking creature experiences it, though the triggers vary dramatically from species to species. He gestured, and a holographic brain appeared above his head. Different regions, lighting up in various colors. The hivelings fear isolation above all else. Their entire psychology revolves around group consciousness and shared experience. Several hiveling students nodded, their compound eyes reflecting the hologram's light. Buzz, one of the more outspoken members of the species, clicked his mandibles in agreement. Aquarians panic when removed from moisture for extended periods, Thane continued, causing the blue-skinned water dwellers in the third row to shift uncomfortably. Luminals dread electromagnetic interference, which can disrupt their energy. Matrix. Verdans fear fire and extreme cold, while my own people, the Altarians, have a deep-rooted terror of complete darkness. The professor moved around the podium, his movements fluid and confident. These fears make sense from an evolutionary perspective. They protect each species from their greatest natural threats. But what happens when we encounter something that appears to have no fear at all? A student near the front raised a tentacle. Professor? Are there really fearless creatures in the galaxy? Thane's eyes gleamed with excitement. An excellent question. This brings us to one of the most fascinating cases in xenobiology. The holographic brain disappeared, replaced by the image of a massive, terrifying creature. Gasps echoed through the lecture hall. The beast stood 12 feet tall, its muscular body covered in natural armor plating that gleamed like black metal. Razor-sharp claws extended from hands that could easily crush a shuttlecraft. Most intimidating of all was its head, filled with rows of teeth that looked capable of biting through reinforced steel. Small predatory eyes scanned the holographic environment with cold intelligence. Behold the grim jaw of Kepler-7, Thane announced with theatrical flair, the apex predator of one of the most dangerous worlds in known space. These creatures have bite forces exceeding 50,000 pounds per square inch. Their claws can tear through titanium plating. They've been observed fighting plasma storms for territory and hunting space leviathans in the void between planets. The classroom fell silent. Even the usually chatty hivelings stopped their constant whispered communications. Several luminals dimmed their natural glow, while the verdans' leaves rustled with nervous energy. Most remarkable of all, Thane continued, extensive neurological studies have shown that Grimjaws possess almost no fear response whatsoever. They approach every situation with the same calm aggression, whether facing a tiny scavenger or a massive predator. They simply do not understand the concept of being afraid. A brave Aquarian student spoke up, her voice wavering slightly. How is that possible, Professor? Surely every creature needs some survival instinct. The Grimjaws evolved differently, Thane explained. On Kepler-7 they reached the top of the food chain so completely that fear became unnecessary. Generation after generation, the fearful individuals were eliminated by natural selection, leaving only those with pure predatory instinct. The hologram rotated slowly, showing the creature from every angle. Its power was undeniable, its presence overwhelming even as a mere projection. Students throughout the hall shrank back in their seats. "Now imagine encountering such a being," Thane said, his voice dropping to create dramatic tension. "How would your species react? What could any of us possibly do against something that has never learned to be afraid?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Students exchanged worried glances, their various physiologies displaying stress in dozens of different ways. Color changes, pheromone releases, electromagnetic fluctuations, and rustling vegetation all indicated the universal discomfort the professor's words had created. From the back of the hall came a quiet sound, a human clearing his throat. All eyes turned toward David, who had been sitting so still and silent that many had forgotten he was there. Professor Thane blinked his large compound eyes in surprise. "Yes, David?" the professor asked, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. It was rare for the human to speak during lectures. David closed his data tablet and leaned forward slightly, in his chair. When he spoke, his voice was calm and conversational, with just a hint of something that made several nearby students unconsciously lean away. "You said these Grimjaws don't experience fear, right? That they're completely fearless because nothing has ever threatened them enough to trigger a fear response?" "That's correct," Thane confirmed. "According to all our research and field observations, they show no fear reactions to any stimuli. We've tested." David nodded thoughtfully as if considering this information. Then he looked up at the professor with eyes that seemed oddly bright in the lecture hall's lighting. "Want a demo on how to make one afraid?" The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Professor Thane's crystalline skin shifted from its normal blue to a pale green, the Altarian equivalent of confusion mixed with growing concern. Students throughout the hall turned to stare at the human, their various expressions all reflecting the same emotion. For the first time in the lecture, everyone in the room was experiencing genuine fear, and somehow, that seemed to be exactly what David had intended. The temperature in the lecture hall seemed to drop several degrees. Professor Thane stood frozen at his podium, his crystalline features cycling through colors as his mind processed what the human had just said. Around the amphitheater, students shifted uneasily in their seats, creating a symphony of rustling, clicking, and humming as different species expressed their discomfort. David rose from his chair with unhurried movements, each step deliberate as he made his way down the stairs, toward the center of the classroom. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence, the sound carrying more weight than seemed possible from such an ordinary action. "I'm sorry, David," Professor Thane managed to say, his voice slightly strained. "Did you just suggest that you could frighten a creature that shows no fear response to anything in the known galaxy?" "I didn't suggest it," David replied, his tone remaining conversational and almost friendly. "I offered to demonstrate it." A nervous twitter ran through the hiveling students. Buzz leaned forward in his seat, his compound eyes fixed on the human. "You're claiming you could make a Grimjaw afraid? Something that has never experienced fear in its entire evolutionary history." David paused on the steps and looked directly at the insectoid student. "Not claiming. Stating a fact based on personal experience." The words hit the classroom like a physical force. Several luminols flickered wildly before dimming to almost nothing. The Verdun's leaves rustled with such intensity, it sounded like wind through a forest. Even the usually calm Altarians began shifting colors rapidly. Professor Thane gripped his podium with both hands. "Personal experience, David, are you telling us that you've actually encountered a Grimjaw?" 3 years ago, David confirmed, continuing his descent toward the lecture area. "Mining survey on Kepler 7. I was part of a resource assessment team. Mostly hivelings, a few Aquarians, one Verdun geologist. Good people, all of them. Very professional." As he spoke, something subtle but unmistakable began to change in David's demeanor. His casual walk became more measured, more purposeful. The easy smile remained on his face, but something else flickered behind his eyes. Students in the rows he passed found themselves leaning away without quite understanding why. The survey was going well until day 3. David continued, reaching the bottom of the amphitheater and turning to face his audience. That's when we had our visitor, big male Grimjaw, probably 14 feet tall. Magnificent creature, really. You don't truly appreciate their size until you see one in person. A Verdun student, her bark-like skin showing stress patterns, spoke up with a voice that trembled like leaves in a storm. "What did your team do?" "Exactly what you'd expect," David replied. They followed their fear responses. The hivelings immediately clustered together, seeking safety in numbers. The Aquarians released distress pheromones and prepared to flee. The Verdun started looking for places to root down and hide. All perfectly reasonable reactions. Professor Thane's skin had now shifted to a deeper green. "And what did you do, David?" The human smile widened slightly, but the expression was not entirely pleasant. "I did what humans do when we're scared, Professor. I started thinking." David moved to the holographic projector controls, his fingers dancing over the interface, with practiced ease. The image of the Grimjaw reappeared, but now it was accompanied by detailed anatomical scans and behavioral data. "You see, everyone was focused on how fearless this creature was," David said, manipulating the hologram to highlight different features. But that was the wrong question entirely. The right question isn't what makes something fearless. The right question is what makes humans afraid. A luminal student pulsed brighter, gathering courage. "And what does make humans afraid?" David turned his full attention to the student, and several nearby beings unconsciously moved away from the energy. Being. Lots of things. Death, pain, loss of loved ones, the unknown. But here's what makes us different from most species. He gestured to the rotating hologram of the Grimjaw. When most species get afraid, they run, hide, cluster together, or freeze. All excellent survival strategies that have worked for millions of years. But humans, when we get scared, we don't just think about survival. We think about solutions. The human began pacing slowly in front of the assembled students, his movements reminding several of them uncomfortably of a predator stalking prey. Fear doesn't shut down human thinking. It enhances it, makes us more creative, more determined, more dangerous. Professor Thane found his voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dangerous?" "Oh yes," David confirmed, stopping, his pacing to look directly at the professor. "You see, when a human encounters something that threatens them, they don't just think about getting away. They think about making sure the threat never comes back. They think about how to hurt it, how to kill it, how to make it understand that hunting humans was a very poor life choice." The classroom had become so quiet that the ambient hum of the Academy's life support system seemed loud. Students throughout the hall sat motionless, afraid that any movement might draw the human's attention. So when this beautiful, fearless, apex predator came strolling into our camp like it owned the place, David continued, my teammates were thinking about how to escape, but I was thinking about how to teach it something new. A brave Aquarian student managed to speak, her voice barely audible. "Teach it what?" David's smile returned, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. "How to be afraid, of course. After all, every creature deserves a complete education." He moved back to the holographic controls, calling up new data streams and technical readouts. The beautiful thing about fear is that it's a learned response. Even creatures that don't normally experience it can be taught, given the right curriculum and a sufficiently motivated teacher. Professor Thane's skin color had now shifted to deep purple, indicating extreme distress. "David, surely you're not suggesting that you actually—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Professor," David interrupted gently. "I'm offering to share the educational techniques I used. After all, this is a class about fear responses across different species. I thought your students might benefit from a practical case study." The human looked out at the sea of alien faces, all staring at him with expressions ranging from fascination to outright terror. "Would you like to hear about the lesson plan I developed for our Grimjaw friend? I think you'll find my teaching methods quite innovative." No one answered. No one moved. The only sounds in the lecture hall were the various breathing, humming, and rustling noises that indicated that despite their fear, the students were still very much alive and paying attention. David nodded approvingly. Good. Class participation is so important for effective learning. David moved to stand directly beneath the holographic Grimjaw, the massive predator's image looming over him like a digital monument to death. The contrast was striking. The human looked small and fragile compared to the armored beast, yet somehow, his presence dominated the lecture hall more completely than the terrifying hologram ever could. Before we discuss the practical application, David said, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher, we need to understand the theory behind human fear responses. Professor Thane was correct when he said fear is universal, but he didn't explain why human fear is different. The professor himself seemed unable to speak, his crystalline features locked in a deep purple that indicated high stress levels. Students throughout the amphitheater leaned forward despite their obvious discomfort, drawn by the human's calm confidence. Most species evolved fear as a survival mechanism to avoid death. David continued, manipulating the holographic controls to display brain scans from various alien species. Look at these patterns. Hiveling fear triggers cluster behavior. Aquarian fear triggers flight responses. Verdon fear triggers defensive rooting, all designed to preserve life through avoidance. He gestured to the rotating brain images, each showing different neural patterns when experiencing fear. But human fear evolved differently. We're persistence hunters, you see, pack predators. For humans, fear isn't just about avoiding death. It's about ensuring that whatever threatened us never gets the chance to threaten us again. A brave luminal student flickered brighter. But that's just aggression, not fear. David turned his attention to the energy being, and several nearby students noticed that the temperature seemed to drop wherever he looked. No, it's much more sophisticated than simple aggression. Aggression is emotional, reactive. What I'm describing is calculated, methodical, and very, very patient. He called up a new holographic display, this one showing human brain scans during fear responses. The pattern was dramatically different from the alien examples. When a human gets scared, multiple regions of the brain activate simultaneously. The amygdala triggers the initial fear response, yes, but then something interesting happens. The image zoomed in on specific neural pathways, highlighting connections between different brain regions. The prefrontal cortex doesn't shut down the way it does in most species. Instead, it works with the fear response, using the adrenaline and heightened awareness to enhance problem-solving capabilities. David began pacing again, his movements hypnotic and unsettling. This is why humans became the dominant species on their world despite being physically inferior to many other predators. We don't just react to threats. We adapt to them, overcome them, and then eliminate them. A hiveling student Buzz clicked his mandibles nervously. But surely even humans have limits. The Grimjaw is far larger and stronger than any Earth predator. True, David acknowledged with a nod. A Grimjaw could kill a human very easily in direct combat. But here's what you're missing. Humans very rarely engage in direct combat with superior opponents. We're ambush predators, tool users, and most importantly, we're social hunters. The human stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the assembled students like a predator evaluating potential prey. When a human encounters something that threatens them, they don't think like individuals. They think like a species. The question isn't, how do I survive this encounter? The question is, how do I ensure this threat never endangers another human? Professor Thane finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. David, I'm talking about teaching, David finished smoothly. Education through practical demonstration, the most effective learning method in the known galaxy. He turned back to the holographic controls, calling up technical specifications for various types of mining equipment. Plasma cutters, seismic charges, gravity manipulators, industrial fabrication units, and atmospheric processors filled the display space around the Grimjaw. The wonderful thing about being part of a resource survey team is that you have access to tools designed to reshape entire planetary surfaces, David explained conversationally. Equipment powerful enough to carve mountains, alter weather patterns, and redirect rivers, all perfectly legal, standard mining technology. Several students were now visibly trembling. The Verdun's leaves rustled constantly, the luminals flickered erratically, and even the normally stoic Altarians showed stress color patterns. But tools are useless without understanding, David continued. That's where the real human advantage lies. We study our problems. We analyze them from every possible angle. We identify weaknesses, exploit vulnerabilities, and create solutions that our opponents never see coming. The holographic Grimjaw rotated slowly as David highlighted various anatomical features. For instance, those impressive jaws that can bite through titanium. The closing muscles are incredibly powerful, but the opening muscles are relatively weak. A simple mechanical clamp could keep those jaws shut indefinitely. More highlighting appeared on the display. The armored hide is thickest on the back and sides, but much thinner around the joints and belly. Those razor-sharp claws are devastating in a forward attack, but they can't reach directly behind the creature. David's voice took on an almost clinical tone that somehow made his words more unsettling than any dramatic pronouncement. The eyes are positioned for hunting large prey, giving excellent forward vision but poor peripheral awareness. The hearing is acute, but they rely heavily on movement detection rather than sound analysis. A Verdun student, her bark showing deep stress patterns, spoke up shakily. You studied it while it was threatening your team? I studied it before. It became a threat, David corrected gently. The moment we arrived on Kepler 7, I researched the local predators. I read every scientific paper, watched every recorded encounter, analyzed every piece of available data. By the time our Grimjaw visitor arrived, I already knew more about its capabilities and limitations than it knew about itself. The human smiled, and the expression was somehow more frightening than any snarl could have been. Knowledge is the most powerful weapon in any human's arsenal, and I had 3 years to acquire quite an extensive education about Grimjaws before putting my knowledge to practical use. Professor Thane's voice was barely a whisper. What kind of practical use? David's smile widened. The kind that results in permanent behavioral modification. After all, the best educational experiences are the ones that students never forget. The lecture hall felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved closer during David's explanation. Students huddled in their seats, no longer merely listening to an academic discussion, but witnessing something far more disturbing. The human stood, calmly in the center of the amphitheater, surrounded by holographic displays of mining equipment and Grimjaw anatomy, looking for all the world like a professor giving a routine lesson. The key to effective education, David began, his voice maintaining that same unsettling calm, is understanding your student's psychology. The Grimjaw had never experienced uncertainty before. Its entire worldview was built on being the ultimate predator, the unquestioned master of every situation it encountered. He gestured to the holographic display, which now showed a 3-dimensional map of the mining site. So my first lesson was about environmental manipulation. I started small, subtle changes that would register on a subconscious level before becoming obvious threats. The map zoomed in to show various locations marked with technical symbols. Seismic charges, placed strategically around the creature's patrol routes, not large enough to cause injury, but sufficient to create unexpected ground vibrations. Imagine walking confidently down a familiar path, only to have the earth shift unexpectedly beneath your feet. A nervous Aquarian student raised a tentacled hand. But wouldn't that just make it angry? Anger requires understanding of what you're angry at, David replied. The Grimjaw couldn't see me, couldn't scent me, couldn't identify the source of these disturbances. For the first time in its life, something was happening that it couldn't explain or control. The holographic display shifted to show gravity, manipulation equipment. Next, I introduced localized gravitational anomalies, areas where the creature's weight would suddenly increase or decrease without warning. Picture trying to leap onto a ledge, only to discover mid-jump that you suddenly weigh twice as much as expected. Professor Thane managed to speak, though his voice cracked. David, this sounds like torture. No, David corrected with that patient teacher's tone. Torture implies cruelty for its own sake. This was education with a specific learning objective. I was teaching the Grimjaw that its assumptions about the world were incorrect. The human moved to a different section of the holographic controls, calling up atmospheric processing data. The third lesson involved sensory manipulation. I used the atmospheric processors to create localized weather changes, sudden temperature drops, unexpected wind patterns, mysterious fog banks that appeared and disappeared without cause. He highlighted various environmental control systems on the display. The beautiful thing about advanced technology is that it allows you to create experiences that seem supernatural to creatures with limited technological understanding. From the Grimjaw's perspective, the world itself was becoming unpredictable and hostile. Students throughout the amphitheater were now displaying maximum stress responses. Hivelings clustered so tightly together they formed a single dark mass. Luminals flickered weakly. Verdans had pulled their limbs in so close they looked like gnarled tree stumps. But the real education began when I introduced the drones. David continued, his tone becoming almost conversational. Mining survey drones are designed to operate autonomously in dangerous environments. They can mimic sounds, project holographic images, and move with complete silence when needed. The display now showed dozens of small flying machines, each equipped with sophisticated sensor and projection equipment. I programmed them to create false prey signs, phantom scents, and auditory illusions. The Grimjaw would hear something moving in one direction, investigate, and find nothing. Then it would hear something else from a completely different location. Luminal student pulsed dim yellow. How long did this continue? 18 hours, David replied matter-of-factly. The first 6 hours were about creating confusion. The Grimjaw kept trying to understand what was happening, following false leads, investigating sounds that led nowhere. But it was still confident, still aggressive. He manipulated the display to show tracking data, movement patterns that grew increasingly erratic over time. Hours 7 through 12 were about building uncertainty. The creature began moving more cautiously, checking its surroundings more frequently, making vocalizations it had never made before. The tracking pattern showed the Grimjaw's path becoming tighter, more defensive, as it began staying closer to areas it considered safe. Hours 13 through 18 were about teaching genuine fear, David continued. By this point, the creature was jumping at shadows, flinching at sounds that didn't exist, constantly looking over its shoulder. It had learned that its environment could not be trusted. Professor Thane's skin had now shifted to a deep purple that indicated extreme distress. And then what happened? David's smile returned, and several students actually whimpered at the sight. Then I gave it a final examination to test what it had learned. The holographic display cleared, showing only a simple representation of the mining camp. A small human figure appeared in the center, surrounded by various pieces of equipment. Walked out into the open, David said simply. No weapons, no protective gear, no drones or environmental manipulators active. Just me, standing calmly in the middle of the camp looking directly at a creature that could kill me with a single swipe of its claws. The display showed the massive Grimjaw approaching through the forest, its movements now cautious and uncertain, rather than the confident swagger it had displayed 18 hours earlier. And do you know what happened when that apex predator, that fearless killing machine, that creature that had never experienced uncertainty in its entire evolutionary history, saw a small human standing there completely unafraid while surrounded by 18 hours of inexplicable phenomena? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. No one in the lecture hall moved. No one seemed to breathe. It stopped, David said quietly. 50 meters away, it just stopped and stared at me, and in that moment, I could see the exact instant when everything clicked into place in its primitive brain. The holographic display showed the Grimjaw freezing mid-step, its body language changing from cautious approach to something that could only be described as recognition of a superior predator. It realized that I had been the source of 18 hours of psychological warfare, David continued. It understood that the small, weak creature standing calmly before it possessed capabilities that made physical strength irrelevant. It learned that there are things in the universe more dangerous than claws and teeth. The display showed the Grimjaw's posture changing, its head lowering, its massive frame actually seeming to shrink as it began backing away. For the first time in its species' evolutionary history, David concluded, a Grimjaw experienced genuine, bone-deep terror. Not just surprise or pain or confusion, but the absolute certainty that it was facing something far more dangerous than itself. A Verdun student whispered, her voice barely audible. What did it do? David's expression was perfectly calm, almost gentle. It ran. The apex predator of Kepler-7, the most fearless creature in known space, turned around and fled through the forest like a frightened animal. He paused, looking out at the sea of terrified alien faces. And that, Professor Thane, is how you teach fear to something that has never learned to be afraid. The silence in the lecture hall stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Students sat frozen in their seats, their various physiologies locked in expressions of shock and terror. Professor Thane gripped his podium so tightly that his crystalline knuckles had turned white, his skin cycling through colors that indicated severe psychological distress. David reached into his pocket and withdrew his data tablet, the simple gesture causing several nearby students to flinch as if he were drawing a weapon. He tapped the device's surface a few times and suddenly the air above the holographic projector shimmered with new images. Survey recording system, Day 3, Hour 19, David announced calmly. All mining operations are required to maintain complete documentation for safety and insurance purposes. The recording was crystal clear, captured by multiple drones and security cameras positioned around the mining camp. It showed exactly what David had described. A massive Grimjaw moved through the forest with increasingly nervous, erratic movements. The creature kept stopping to look around, its head swiveling constantly as if expecting attack from any direction. The assembled students watched in horrified fascination as the apex predator approached the human mining camp. They could see David, standing alone in the center of the cleared area, his posture relaxed and confident. The contrast between the tiny human and the enormous predator was stark, yet somehow the human seemed to dominate the scene. The recording captured the exact moment when the Grimjaw spotted David. The creature's entire body language changed instantly. Its confident stalk became a cautious creep, then a hesitant approach and finally a complete stop. For several long moments, predator and human stared at each other across 50 meters of empty ground. Then, in a display that defied everything, the students thought they knew about apex predators. The Grimjaw began backing away. Its movements became increasingly frantic as some invisible realization dawned. The creature turned and crashed through the forest, fleeing with such desperate haste that it left a trail of broken trees in its wake. Official report filed with the Galactic Mining Authority, reference number 77 Alpha 992, David said, switching off the recording. Public record, available for review by any interested parties. Buzz, the hiveling student, finally found his voice. How did you know it would work? David shrugged, the gesture somehow more unsettling than any dramatic proclamation. I didn't. But that's the thing about humans and problem solving. We don't let uncertainty stop us from trying new approaches. We adapt, experiment, and learn from our failures. He moved back toward his seat at the rear of the amphitheater, and students automatically leaned away as he passed. The aisle seemed to widen around him, creating a clear path up the stairs as if he were surrounded by an invisible force field. You see, Professor Thane was absolutely correct about fear being universal, David continued as he walked, but he missed the most important aspect of the equation. It's not enough to study how different species experience fear. You also need to understand how different species create fear in others. A luminal student flickered weakly. Are you saying humans are uniquely good at causing fear? David paused at his row and turned back to face the class. I'm saying humans are uniquely good at solving problems. Fear is just one tool in our educational toolkit. We're equally skilled at inspiring hope, encouraging cooperation, or fostering curiosity, depending on what the situation requires. Professor Thane had finally managed to cycle his skin color back to something approaching normal blue, though flecks of purple stress patterns still showed. David, Was that intended as some kind of threat to this class? The human looked genuinely confused by the question. A threat? Professor, that was a practical demonstration of the concepts you were teaching. Your students wanted to understand fear responses across different species. I simply provided a case study that illustrated how humans approach the subject. He gestured to the still visible holographic displays showing mining equipment and Grimjaw anatomy. Education is most effective when it includes real-world applications. Theory without practice is just academic exercise. A Verdant student, her bark showing deep stress grooves, spoke up shakily. But you're talking about psychological warfare, systematic intimidation, calculated cruelty. I'm talking about effective problem-solving, David corrected gently. The Grimjaw presented a threat to my teammates. I eliminated that threat using the resources available to me. No one was harmed, property damage was minimal, and the solution was permanent. He sat down and reopened his data tablet as if nothing unusual had happened. The creature learned valuable lessons about the dangers of assuming superiority based on physical capabilities. My teammates learned about human adaptability and resourcefulness. And now all of you have learned something about the practical applications of xenopsychological theory. Students throughout the amphitheater continued staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror. The casual way he discussed 18 hours of psychological manipulation was somehow more disturbing than any angry threats could have been. Professor Thane cleared his throat, the sound echoing strangely in the tense atmosphere. Class, I think we should... That is, perhaps we should discuss the ethical implications of... Oh, there's no need to worry about ethics, Professor, David interrupted with a friendly smile. Everything I did was completely within legal parameters. Environmental manipulation is standard mining practice. Drone operations fell under normal survey protocols. No regulations were violated. No harm was caused to protected species. The human looked up from his tablet with those bright, unsettling eyes. After all, education should always be conducted within proper ethical boundaries. We wouldn't want anyone to think humans were unnecessarily cruel or aggressive. A hiveling student in the middle rows began making a high-pitched whining sound that indicated extreme distress. Several luminals had dimmed to almost nothing. The Verdans looked like they were trying to root themselves into their chairs for protection. Now then, David continued cheerfully, should we continue with the lecture? I'm particularly interested in hearing Professor Thane's thoughts on recovery patterns from traumatic learning experiences. It's such a fascinating aspect of xenopsychology. Professor Thane stared at the human for several long moments, his crystalline features still showing traces of stress coloration. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled but carried an undertone that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. David, I think that might be enough for today's demonstration. Are you sure? David asked with apparent concern. We've only covered basic intimidation techniques. I haven't even mentioned the more advanced applications. For instance, what happens when you teach an entire species to fear humans rather than just one individual? The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Several students actually whimpered. That won't be necessary, Thane said quickly. Class dismissed. We'll continue this discussion next week, perhaps with a different focus. As students began filing out of the amphitheater, their movements were notably different from when they had entered. Gone was the casual chatter and easy socializing. Instead, they moved in tight groups, staying as far away from the human section as possible. Many kept glancing back at David as if expecting him to follow them. The hivelings departed as a single, tightly clustered mass, their usual individual personalities subsumed into group protective behavior. The Aquarians left quickly, their blue skin showing stress patterns that wouldn't fade for hours. The luminals flickered erratically as they floated toward the exits, their usual steady glow replaced by nervous pulsing. David remained seated, calmly organizing his notes and data files as if he had just attended a routine lecture on agricultural techniques, rather than delivered a masterclass in psychological warfare. When the last student had left, Professor Thane slowly approached the human section. David, the professor said quietly, what you described today, was any of it actually necessary? The human looked up from his tablet with those same bright, unsettling eyes. "Professor, my teammates went home safely to their families. The Grimjaw learned valuable lessons about making better life choices. The local ecosystem remained undisturbed except for some rearranged vegetation. I'd say it was an optimal outcome for everyone involved." But the psychological impact on the creature was educational, David finished smoothly. "Fear is a learning tool, Professor, one of the most effective teaching methods in the galaxy. That Grimjaw now understands concepts it never would have grasped through any other form of instruction." Thane's skin cycled through several colors before settling on a pale green. "And your classmates today? Was terrifying them also educational?" David's smile returned, and Thane found himself taking an involuntary step backward. "Oh yes, very. Much so. They learned that humans are not the simple, harmless creatures they appeared to be. They learned that intelligence and creativity can be far more dangerous than claws and teeth. Most importantly, they learned to treat humans with appropriate respect." The professor struggled to find words. "Respect shouldn't come from fear, shouldn't it?" David asked mildly. "Every species in this galaxy respects Grimjaws because they fear them. They give them wide berths, study them from safe distances, and make sure never to threaten them. Now they'll treat humans with the same careful consideration." He stood and shouldered his bag with casual movements that somehow seemed loaded with potential threat. "After all, Professor, isn't that what education is really about? Teaching people to make better decisions based on a more complete understanding of reality?" As David walked toward the exit, Thane found himself unable to move, frozen by a combination of fascination and fear. At the door, the human paused and looked back with that same friendly, terrible smile. "Thank you for the excellent lecture, Professor. I'm looking forward to next week's class. I believe the topic is cooperative behaviors across species, isn't it? I have some wonderful examples of how humans encourage cooperation in reluctant partners." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Professor Thane alone in the lecture hall with the lingering holographic displays of mining equipment and predator anatomy. The professor stood in silence for several minutes, trying to process what had just occurred. Finally, he moved to his communication console and began composing a message to the Academy's administration. The subject line read, "Urgent curriculum review required. Xenopsychology Department." As he typed, Thane couldn't shake the feeling that David's presentation hadn't been a spontaneous demonstration at all, but a carefully planned lesson designed to teach the entire Academy something important about humanity's place in the galactic community. The most disturbing part was that the lesson had been extremely effective.